Okay, hello and welcome to our Decolonial Seminar 2024 edition. And our first guest presenter is Kyria Finardi from Federal University of Espírito Santo in Brazil. She's a senior lecturer, associate professor, and researcher in the Department of Languages, Culture, and Education, and the Graduate Program of Education. With over 15 years of experience in higher education research, teaching, and practice, she has founded and coordinated the language division of the International Office of her university. Her research interests range from decolonization of knowledge, internationalization, the role of languages and technologies in education, and multilingualism, with talks in multiple languages and in many different venues all over the world. She has presented her research in numerous international academic and professional conferences. She has developed and taught courses in partnerships with different universities worldwide through virtual exchange, among others. She's the president of the International Association of Applied Linguistics, co-founder and coordinator of the Ibero-American Association of Applied Linguistics, and co-founder of the ILA Research Network, EME, SDGs, and EDI, with substantial track record on coordinating different research projects in collaboration with different universities. And she very often comes to Valencia to conduct her research. We've been privileged enough in previous editions of our masters to have her in person, but now she's in Brazil and we are having our classes online. So it all worked out. It all works out in the end, and still it's a great honor to have her, and I think we can learn a lot in this remote instruction mode. Okay, so Kyria, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. And thank you so much for being here once again.
Thank you very much, Anna. It is a pleasure to be here with your students today and also with participating in this seminar. I want to say that it's always a pleasure to connect with Valencia, with Spain, and I am very sorry about the floods and what happened with Valencia. And this is another reason why I'm so happy to extend the support that many Brazilians have shown and felt towards Spain. So feel hugged and supported by us. Today, I'm here to tell you a story. Well, actually, I'm here to tell you many stories. The story of English as a global language, which is intertwined and interrelated with many other different stories. Can you pass the slide, please, Anna? So before we start, I'm going to tell you one of my stories, starting with, this family of mice. So as usually stories go in English, we start stories with once upon a time. So this was a beautiful day, a very hot, sunny day. And the family of mice were playing in the yard while the mother mice was preparing lunch. All of a sudden, a huge, very hungry cat appeared. And when the cat saw the little mice playing in the yard, of course, the cat thought, my lunch is guaranteed. So when the cat was about to jump over and eat the mice, the mother mouse came running out of the kitchen. She stared at the cat and she barked. Ruff, ruff. The cat, completely displaced and confused, ran away. And so the mother mouse looked at her children and she said, "You see, little children, never forget this message and this lesson. It is very important to learn another language. It may very well save your lives." And this is a story that I usually tell my students in the first day of classes. Like Anna, I am an English language teacher educator. And in Brazil, sometimes we have to remind students of the importance of learning other languages, and even English, because although it has a powerful function to connect and to make people connect with other students and people around the world, many of the people in Brazil and many of my students will never have a chance to travel or to use other languages, even English, outside the internet, for example. And so it is very important for us to reflect about the importance of learning other languages. But then And so as to bring you another story and to start setting the tone and the context for the stories that I'm going to share with you today, I bring you this African proverb. I think it's from Zimbabwe, if I'm not mistaken. I usually use it in my presentations, and I like it very much. And it says, and I'm going to read to you my adaptation, my free adaptation of this proverb. If the lioness doesn't tell her story, the hunter will. And the reason why I'm bringing this proverb and also story to you is to raise awareness of the fact that depending on the languages that we speak, we may have more or less access to certain stories, narratives, experiences. And I think this is why this seminar promoted by Anna is so important. It is important for us to reflect about the languages we are learning and also the impact that these languages have on the others. And because of the role of English in the world today, my goal, what I would like to do with you today is to reflect, next slide, please, Anna, with the role of English in the stories that we can hear and produce also. And so as to inspire you, since you're going to have some authors and some people talking about literature and sharing of stories from around the world with you, I would like to share with you 3 books that have inspired me to produce this talk. And of course, invite you to read them if you want. And instead of asking questions in the end, I'm going to ask you a question in the beginning of my presentation. You can think about it, and perhaps in the end of this presentation, if we have time, you can reach out to me either by email or if we have time here as a discussion to answer this question. And the question relates to the role of English in the world today and whether it is a tragedy, a comedy, or a satire, in the sense that is it a hero? I mean, the role of English, does it work as a hero, as an anti-hero, or how? And these are the 3 books, as I said, that I read to prepare this talk. The first one is by a Dutch sociolinguist, Abraham de Swaan, Words of the World, and describes the geopolitics and the language system. The second one is not by a linguist, it's by a sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, that has a very important work related to symbolic capital. And the third one is a book organized by me with many authors from the Global South, mostly from Latin America, but also from New Zealand, Greece, other places in the world, that describe the implications of having English in contexts where English is not the native language. Next slide, please. And so as to start my story with you, I'm going to base not only on those 3 books, but also on some articles, some papers that I'm providing the references for you here in case you want to read them in the future. They provoke us to think of English not only as a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or, you know, the most dangerous dinosaur in the linguistic raising ground, but also its role in scientific communication. I'm going to read my notes here. These 2 papers that I'm citing here, Swales, 1907, and Tardy, 2004, they describe the increasing domination of English as the world's leading medium of international professional communication. And they look at this role, especially looking at English as academic purposes. I think it's one of the disciplines that you have in this course, right? So the questions, these papers question whether English is becoming too successful and reviews several resulting ideological challenges for English as academic purposes. Although not all of these challenges are accepted or well-founded, according to these authors, these papers argue that the resistance to this triumphalism of English is also the responsibility of English teachers. So it's very important for all of you here, future English teachers, to be aware of this. The resistance can be encouraged by further research into academic registers of languages other than English. And this is why I think this seminar promoted by Anna is so important, to allow us to think of other possibilities, other registers, other stories, and other ways of producing and reading others and sharing other stories. Next slide, please. So I bring you another reference from Anna Christina Holdgren, and she, referring to the two previous articles that describe English as this Tyrannosaurus Rex, as a very dangerous language, that as a Frankenstein, sometimes as a cuckoo, she mentions that actually English could be seen as a red herring. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this concept. In literature, for example, the red herring is used as, or the herring is used as an artifact that distracts the attention of the reader from the main plot or from the what is going to happen in the book. And the red herring, according to in what she brings, Anna Christina, in this paper, could be also a clue or a piece of information that is or is intended to be misleading or distracting. So this is used in cinema, in literature, etc. And according to Anna Christina Holdgren, the rise of English as the world's main international language has prompted a social justice agenda underpinned by an assumption that English causes or exacerbates inequality and injustice in the world. So in her position statement, she sets out to problematize and complexify this assumption, suggesting that English is neither a Tyrannosaurus Rex or a cuckoo, nor a lingua frankensteina, but a red herring. So distracting attention away from the underlying causes of inequality. In other words, it is not English itself that is the evil or the culprit or, what produces inequalities. It may correlate with inequalities and social injustice, but we have to be very aware that it acts as a red herring, distracting us from the real causes of social inequality. I hope that I may at least raise awareness to some of these causes and how we can deal with that in terms of our linguistic roles and functions. Next slide, please, Anna. So I bring you another paper, this one produced by me, as a reaction to the previous ones. So after reading Swales and Anna Christina Holdgren and all of this talking about English either as the culprit or as a red herring, I propose a reflection about the possibility of viewing global English as an arena to use an ecology of approaches towards social justice. So in this paper, I bring a discussion that problematizes approaches that are purely recognition-oriented, such as the colonial perspectives, for example, based on race, while also questioning the use of redistribution approaches that are based on class only, and that do not consider critical perspectives. So drawing on the work mostly on the colonial authors from Latin America, where I am located, I bring 4 vignettes from my experience in my classes to illustrate this discussion and advance an argument that an ecology of approaches is needed to tackle the recognition issues involved in language, but also to redress redistribution. And that language researchers and also teachers have to incorporate new questions, perhaps, and approaches to engage to a much greater extent to engage with the underlying causes of social inequality, social injustice that correlate with the use of English. So as I said, it is not English that produces this, but the use of English as a global language very often correlates with this. Next slide, please. So to start with this discussion, I bring you some of the concepts and some of the areas from which the first book, The Language Constellation by this one brought, and to show you that he drew on sociology, biology, political economy, and many different areas to produce his theory of the language system in the world. Next slide, please. I'll bring you some of the, and also astronomy. I'll bring you some of these insights. So all of these slides that I'm showing you now are all from the first book, by this one, Words of the World. And according to him, human evolution can be described, you can see in the picture the Babel Tower, which is a reference from the Bible, right? So the world is composed of about 5,000 groups of people, or depending on the count, because some books would describe it at 6,000 or more, who speak different languages, but remain connected through those who speak more than one language. Thus, it is multilingualism that has kept humanity separated by so many languages together. In other words, people like you and me who speak more than one language are the glue that keeps humanity together, despite the many different languages that do not communicate with each other. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go deeper into this. I just want to show you that according to this one's description of language system, there are different underlying circles in this system. He uses political sociology and political economy to describe how he came to devise this proposal. And in this language system, very similar to a language constellation, there is a central hub in this galaxy, and the planets or the languages are placed in concentric circles, some more central, some more peripheric, depending on their value. We're going to go deeper into this later on. Next slide, please. So he describes the emergence of language, and I think we can all agree with this, as a cause for marvel. It is incredible that language is not only what distinguishes us from other animals, because though other animals have languages, they do not use this to the purposes that we do, or the way that we do, we human beings. And the evolution of languages into innumerable, mutually unintelligible languages is an amazing testimony to human ingenuity. All of this, I mean, the emergence of languages is the result of human action. And almost none of this was the outcome of human intention. In other words, we learn our first languages as unintentionally. And this is incredible how the movement of people in different places and migration has produced more than 5,000 languages in the world. Next one, please. But this system of worlds and languages is also described by this one in terms of astronomy, and he even compares it with the clouds, because just as we have many clouds, and it's very difficult to say where one cloud starts and when one cloud ends, it is the same with languages. In this language system that we have, it is very difficult to see where one language starts, the dialect finishes, and the contact between the languages. And we have uncountable languages and clouds, of course. And according to him, just like clouds are connected by air, with languages, they are connected by multilinguals or bilinguals like you and me. So this is something fantastic, to think of us, bilinguals, multilinguals, as the air that connects the world together. Next slide, please. He also brings examples from biology, so not only astronomy, but also biology. I think this is fantastic. And he gives this example that just as for biological species, they are defined by the capacity to reproduce. This is, one of the systems in which biology describes the species. And languages, just like biological species, they are defined by their capacity of any two speakers to understand one another. So just as species are subdivided into many varieties that can indeed interbreed, within languages, various mutually intelligible dialects are discerned. So biological varieties and languages shade into one another, making classification controversial, as I said, just like the clouds. And this is the beautiful part for me. Mating is to biology what understanding is to languages. Look how beautiful this is. And the role of, again, multilinguals, bilinguals in this intelligibility. Next slide, please. And of course, in thinking about languages and differentiating among them, context is very important. I bring only one example to have a visual representation of how important context is. Next slide, please. We can see that context is very important, especially because it determines very often how languages are used or shared or understood among speakers. And mutual intelligibility does not depend only on the languages involved, like breeding in biology. It also depends on the individuals and the context, which may either facilitate mutual comprehension or hinder it, as we're going to see. Next slide, please. According to the language systems, languages are connected, as I said, by multilingual speakers who don't learn a second language or a foreign language in a random fashion. And this is what I want to call your attention. Although L1, so our first native language, is learned without any effort on our part, the story is completely different when we think about learning second additional foreign languages. Because the world's language system is hierarchical. The notion of a word system with a periphery, a semi-periphery, and a core is central to the contemporary political macro-sociology. The task is then to identify the linguistic dimension of this evolving system called the global language constellation system by this one. So state, nation, citizenship, all of these concepts and their interconnections constitute another central theme of political sociology that are connected to the context that I mentioned before, and that interact and interfere with language constellations and even determine the position of languages in this constellation system. Next slide, please. So, according to this one's description of this language constellation system, there is a core, like the sun in the center, and central, hypercentral, and peripheral languages. And peripheral languages are described by him and actually represent the majority, more than, actually 98% of the languages are peripheral languages. And these are peripheral because they're used by less than 10% of humankind. They're also peripheral because they are languages of memory, conversation, narration, stories, orality, rather than reading, writing, and record. So a lot of these languages are not available in schools, in texts, and registrations to pass from one generation to another. And that is why it is so important for us to learn and to be aware of other languages and other stories, and the many stories that we may be missing simply because we do not have access to them because of languages. Next, please. So these are the central languages, as you can see in this image. I hope it's clear. So we have in the center the central languages, the supercentral languages, and unlike peripheral languages, these are written and used in education. So they can be transferred from one generation to the other. Many of their speakers are multilingual, and they learned second languages mostly upward. That means they learned a second language that usually has more value or more strength than the language that they speak, in a centripetal mode, that is, in a higher level in this hierarchy. And L2 learning and use also, and this is very important for us to understand, it reinforces this hierarchical nature of the world language system. And when we talk about hierarchies, later on, I'm going to address this a little bit more in terms of decolonial approaches. It is important for us to be aware of the hierarchical strengthening that we do with the languages that we use. Next, please. Supercentral languages. There are only 12, as you can see here. And these are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, German, Hindi, Japanese, Malay, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Swahili. So your language and my language is here. If your first language is Spanish, mine is Portuguese. And except for Swahili, that does not have as many speakers. All the other 11 languages, they're considered supercentral languages because they have more than 100 million speakers in the world. So depending on the number of speakers and the strength of the languages, they are considered and placed in the system as supercentral, central, or peripheral languages. Next slide, please. And of course, no surprise for anyone here, that the hub of this linguistic galaxy, the hypercentral, the only hypercentral language that holds the entire constellation together is English, the language of global communication at the center of the 12 solar language system. And this, of course, has many implications, not only for astrology and astronomy, but also for the use of languages and what we do with these languages. Next slide, please. So we have to stop for a minute and ask ourselves, so how did English get there, to the center of the galaxy, replacing the sun in this constellation system? Well, there are many stories to tell to explain this. Some of them are related to the role of globalization, connecting people and languages. And of course, because globalization connects peoples and languages, most learn upwards with an eye to access the next higher level of the world system. In a sense, people try to learn the language that will give them the most value or the most possibilities of use that language. Next slide, please. And this one proposes this concept of Q value, which is a proportion of people who speak a language in a given constellation. And because of this Q value of a language, languages that have more Q value or that are more valuable, that have more symbolic capital in a way, will be preferred at the expense of others, because people tend to learn the language that gives them the greater communication advantage, that is, the greater Q value. Next slide, please. And now we turn to the second book I mentioned, Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, as I mentioned, who inspired this one to propose the Q value, because Pierre Bourdieu came before this one. And he proposed a very important theory that permeates not only sociology and linguistics, but all the areas of knowledge in the world. According to Pierre Bourdieu's theory of symbolic capital, and linguistic capital is one of them, this is related to the accumulation of linguistic skills that predetermine a person's position in society. As such, it is a form of cultural capital. And people prefer to learn the language with the highest linguistic capital, and that most increases the Q value of their repertoire. And the unequal terms of exchange are very much determined by the Q values and cultural linguistic capital of the languages involved. So it's important for us to be aware that languages are not neutral, and teaching, learning certain languages is not neutral either. It has implications for the stories we're going to access and produce and share. Next slide, please. Sorry. And so, as I said, learning an L1 is a natural process, and unless we have a biological impairment, everybody, regardless of their language, their first language, manages to learn their first language proficiently by the age of 5. Now, the story is completely different when we think about learning or acquiring a second language. Because unlike L1, or unlike the acquisition, the learning of a first language, learning a second language usually requires a choice, time, attention, memory, and very often financial resources, depending on the country and the situation and the status, the political and linguistic status of this language in a given context. To give you one example, in Brazil, only English is part of the mandatory curriculum in schools. And so learning other languages in Brazil would require financial resources to pay for private language institutes for kids to be able to learn that. Also, what is important to differentiate here, as you can see, I wrote here that L1 is acquisition and unconscious process, I'm sorry. Whereas L2 is usually learned, so not acquired unconsciously and naturally. Sorry. Next slide, please. Let me drink some water. So since learning an L2 is different from learning or acquiring a first language, we have to ask ourselves, so which second additional or foreign language should we learn? And this question can be visually described as the dilemma that I am putting here for you, of whether we want to be a big fish in a small pond or be a small fish in a big pond. And to put this into linguistic terms, and next slide, please. I give you the example of two languages, Dutch and English. What you can see in the map on the left is the number of places and countries that speak English in the world. So as you can see, the whole world, the whole map is basically green. Whereas in the second map, you can see the number of places where people speak Dutch. So if you learn Dutch, you're going to be a big fish in a small pond in the sense of, the number of places where you'll be able to use this language. Whereas if you learn English, you might be a small fish in a big pond. In other words, the value that learning a language will give you in terms of communication, mobility, and also Q value, as we mentioned before. Next slide, please. In terms of this language constellation, and now going back a little bit to this one's book, this one that I'm showing here, related to the preferences people have for learning a language rather than another, it is assumed that given half a chance, people will learn the language that provides them with the greater communication advantage, as I said, or the Q value according to this one. Next slide, please. So now we know that people learn a certain language and they use a certain language as an L2 because we don't have that choice for L1, but we do have a choice for L2. So we know that people will learn the language that is more relevant, let's say, to them. And going back to the story that I began in this session today with the three mice, maybe the mother could have said to their children, well, it is important to learn another language, and maybe this language should be learned first is, A, B, or C, because languages will bring different functions and different possibilities for us to communicate. And this is because language, as we said, are learned upwards from the small to the large language, and from the poor to the rich, from the subjugated to the dominant one. So it is very important to us to be aware of these power relations and hierarchical relations imposed by the languages that we speak and learn. Next slide, please. So we can very much ask ourselves whether there is a choice to learn the languages. And as you can see in these images here, people will select the most useful language to learn, and the benefits of English are entirely undeserved and unjustified, but so are most of the advantages and detriments that befall nations as accidents of geography and history, such as location, climate, the access to natural resources, and so forth. A movement to right the wrongs of language hegemony has spread across the Western world, advocating the right of all people to speak the language of their choice. This is mostly what the colonial approaches propose, that people should have the linguistic right to speak the language of their choice or their first language, especially in education. But according to this one, what really matters and what really decides what is the right of human beings is not the right to speak whatever language people want or people wish, but the freedom of everybody else to ignore what they say in a language of their choice. If, on the other hand, people want to communicate beyond the narrow circle of their linguistic peers, they will have to learn the supercentral language that links them to wider circles of communication. So according to this one, it is not, although we have to acknowledge the right of people to speak the language they want, we also have to acknowledge the fact that, people have the right to ignore you depending on the language that you want to speak. And so this, when we hear, most of us, either English teachers or becoming English teachers, have to be aware of the power relations involved in teaching, speaking, and using a language such as English that glues other linguistic systems together and can give access to other languages and other stories, as I said in the beginning. Next slide, please. And also, something that we have to bear in mind, as I said, peripheral languages are those that are not accessible in schools. And so, and we said that English got to the position where it is today because of globalization, that made the world, produced the world into this global village. But in this global village that we live, we have to stop and think whether everybody has access to this, who are the citizens in this global village? Does everybody have a passport in this global village? Does everybody have access to this global village? And so learning an L2 or any other language at a formal level, that is in school, usually requires literacy and also resources, as we said. So this will turn out to be a major threshold for language learning among the less privileged societies. And this is something that we have to bear in mind. So going back to the red herring in the beginning of my presentation, it's not English that produces this disadvantage and the social inequalities, but perhaps access to English and other languages in formal schooling is what produces these social inequalities. Next one, please. And because of this, we use the metaphor of language death or extinction, especially those who are sociologists and linguists, applied linguists, who are aware and concerned about the role of minority languages. And this conjures up the image of a lost species, just like in biology. A species may be in danger of extinction. Linguists also are concerned about the possibility of certain languages, especially minority, or some like to call it minoritized languages, to disappear. But a biological species, however, may be safe by safeguarding its environment. Now, for a language to survive, it is a lot more difficult because a considerable number of people must continue to use it despite changes in the social and linguistic environment. So we see the role and activism, agentism of people in promoting or invisibilizing certain languages. Next, please. I know that this is very important in Spain, a country that has, of course, a very powerful language, Spanish, but also many other languages spoken and co-official. So this is something that we have to think about, right? We can, going back to the myth of the Babel Tower, we can ask, just like Ginsburg and Weber have asked in 2011, whether Babel is a divine punishment or a heavenly gift, in the sense that whether a language diversity is a punishment or it is something good. Diversity is good. And to give you visual representation with numbers, look at this. Africa is one of the most, it's one of the world's most linguistically diverse continent, with 30% of the world's languages, but only 15% of its inhabitants, whereas Europe, only 4% of the world's languages, but 10% of the population. So we can see how numbers here play and how diversity may be better or worse depending on the evaluation system we are using. Next one, please. And in this language management system, and especially in post-colonial states, language policy alone does not make as much as a difference as opposition to an important language group, to the introduction of a national language. And this is because of language jealousy. Next slide, please. To give you an example of this, I'm bringing the case of India, but we could also mention Africa and many other countries where this happened, where English and the colonial language disputed spaces with many different varieties or many different natural local languages. The colonial language wins the race and the jealousy battle. And this is what happened, for example, in India, where the use of English excludes many illiterate Indians because English neutralizes Hindi, which is a majority language, local language used in the southern states. And this is a result of jealousy towards Hindi because local communities did not want the local majority language, Hindi, to become the national language. English took the place and became co-official language in India. Next slide, please. This also happened in many African countries where colonial languages took the place of local languages, and in many of these places represented the exclusion of those languages in schooling systems. For example, English and French remained both colonial languages. They remained a hyper-collective good, but only to those who went to school. Colonial languages then, in this case, English and French, and the education system operated as a mechanism of exclusion to those who did not have access to school and to these languages. And indigenous or local languages did not become national languages, as I said before, because of this linguistic diversity, jealousy, war between local and colonial languages. Next, please. So what about Europe? We can think about Europe as, usually in lip service, at least we say that the more languages, it's excellent. But in fact, what happens is the more languages we have in a continent, such as Europe, the more English becomes the actual used official language. And the subject of languages has been the great non-deed of European integration. This is in page 144 in this one's book. And this is because jealousy between established state-supported language groups will also, and for a long time to come, prevent the adoption of any single language as a sole official language of the European Union, making, as I said, although there are 11 or more official languages, in practice, English is the one that remains in practice the most used one. Next slide, please. So we can also see a case of jealousy here, but with central languages. This is, I've already mentioned this before, it's just the system of constellation, linguistic constellation by the Swan, where English is the only hypercentral language in the singular. Then we have the 12 supercentral languages, the central languages, and the peripheral ones. So as you can see in the world map, the world is divided also into global south, global north, in terms of the linguistic system too. Next slide, please. And more recently, I've been very interested in looking at two very powerful central languages, our languages, Spanish and Portuguese, because together they represent almost 1 million speakers in the world. They're spoken in 4 continents. They represent 11% of the world population, but only 1% of indexed scientific production in Spanish or Portuguese. Next slide, please. So this made me and motivated some of my research and my current interests to look at why the situation of Spanish and English is like this in the world. And so some of my current research interests relate to the academic production, how are the languages disputed and used in the availability and access of these stories and academic production in the world. Is there an ecology of knowledges depending on the languages in which they are produced? how is the internationalization or sharing of higher education leading and dealing with the multiple possibilities of languages? And what are the issues related to access to education and this cultural value or linguistic capital that Bourdieu mentions? And finally, and more recently, I've been looking also at how decolonial sociology, political economy approaches can help us understand our role as English teachers and also users and bilingual, multilingual speakers. Next slide, please. And so as to give you some practical examples of how my research or things that my research has been showing. This is an image of the world map. You can see it's a very distorted world map because it was produced with citations. In other words, when a paper is published and it receives a citation, it means people are reading that work. And although, as I said in the beginning, although Portuguese and Spanish, for example, represent almost 1 billion speakers in the world and 11% of the population, actually, when we look at the map of the world and the continents where it is spoken, we can see that, for example, Latin America is almost invisible in this map, where Spanish is spoken. Also, Africa, where Portuguese is spoken, is almost inexistent. And this is because although 90% of all the publications in the Web of Science are in English, it's not all the papers that are published in English, and for sure, not in the other languages that are cited, read. In other words, the stories that we have access to will depend on the languages that we tell the stories and the languages that we can access for these stories. Next slide, please. I'll leave you here the references, but Anna can share the slides with you. And all of these references are open access, so you can access them in the site. I will leave you the references in the end if you're interested in going deeper into this. This is another map of the academic production in Latin America. And as you can see, or not, maybe you cannot see Latin America because it's very difficult actually to locate Latin America. And the reason for this is because, of course, when we think about papers produced in other languages besides English, we see that this knowledge is mostly inexistent, or not inexistent, it's invisible. What is more important, and this is, the decolonial effort that I've been trying to do, is that it doesn't really matter if we write in English, because it is not only the language that we publish or the language that we write in that will affect the visibility of this knowledge, but also the location where this knowledge comes from. So if you write a paper in English, and this paper is coming from Spain or Brazil, for example, you're going to have a lot less chance of having this paper accepted in a journal when compared to an author from Wales, for example, that has only 2 universities. But because it's an English-speaking country from the global north, chances are that paper is going to be accepted. Ours is not, just because of the location and because we are using English as L2 and not as an L1. Also, it's not only the location, as I said, but also the political and the hierarchical position of our country, because even countries where English is spoken as an L1, such as Africa, South Africa, India, Jamaica, for example, they wouldn't have the same chance or the same probability of being accepted as another L1 English-speaking countries such as UK, US, etc. Next slide, please. So these are some of the power relations that I've been investigating in my research. Also, I've been trying to, as I said, draw on decolonial perspectives to look at the ecology of languages and knowledges, and how this ecology or lack of ecology of knowledges is producing these abyssal lines that Boaventura de Souza Santos mentions, where part of the world and part of the knowledge of the world, like the iceberg that you can see in the first picture, is visible, less than 1 or 2%, whereas most of the knowledge is submerged and invisible to us in these abyssal lines. And again, going back to the first story that I told you, This is related to the languages in which we can share these stories. These are three references that I leave you here that describe, the tensions, the competitions between languages, and also refer and describe languages as the Oscar of the Hollywood film, in terms of making a metaphor and a comparison between the role of languages in the stories and in the films, in the pieces of art that we can have access to. Next slide, please. Another thing that I've been investigating lately in my research is the role of languages in the internationalization of higher education. I'm using the second map inverted because to sort of question the fact that we in the Global South, we send students to the Global North, and with the students, we send also financial resources to finance the higher education system in the Global North, whereas the Global South is seen as, a place where we can send students, send resources, produce data, but not a place where we can also produce theory, we can theorize, and we can also produce knowledge and share knowledge, not only because of the languages, as I said, but also because of our geopolitical stance and location. Next slide, please. There's something happening here in my screen. Okay, so these are other issues that I've been looking at in my work, issues of identity, coloniality, racism that permeate and are permeated by the languages we use, teach, and learn. I'm not going to go into this, but I'll leave you the references for you to look further if you're interested in this. And next slide, please. I think we are running out of time because I would like to give you some time for questions or comments, if we can. I know that you have to leave in about a few minutes. So I'll leave you here the link to the site where you can find all of these references. Anna can share the slides with you and the references. And I thank you very much for listening to me and for helping me produce and tell other stories in other languages too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Wonderful, as always, so much food for thought, so many interesting perspectives that you brought to us that I hope we can all carry to our teaching context, to our awareness, as you very well mentioned, in our multilingual environment that we are teaching English in. Okay, people are saying thank you in the chat. I think they have really enjoyed the talk. And yeah, we're very privileged to have Kyria collaborating in this masters, not just coming every year to give us talks. She has even co-supervised some master's dissertations in the past. I don't know if Sandra is here, but her brother did the master's, Adrian, and now I have her as a student. And well, we co-supervised his thesis, and he came up with with learning situation that he implemented in secondary education, combining some of these ideas of changing the perspective, raising awareness of the role of English, bringing critical perspectives, and of course, overcoming that debate that we hear sometimes when you hear parents say, oh, I don't want my kids to learn Valencian because all the time they will waste learning Valencian, they could invest in learning English. And I mean, how flawed that reasoning is, right? It's actually the opposite. If you are multilingual, then it will be much easier for you to learn all the languages if you're bilingual or multilingual. And obviously, if part of your identity and your linguistic heritage and part of your linguistic repertoire is not present there, then part of your identity is being erased, right? We also co-supervise a master's dissertation by Silvia that also dealt with multilingualism, and she was really successful. So yeah, if you happen to to be interested in and pursue some of these topics for your master's thesis, there's this option also to be co-supervised by Kyria. I like to open the floor for questions, comments, etc. Would anyone like to say something, to ask a question?
Can you stop sharing the screen so I can see the faces? Because I can only see yeah, excellent. Now I can see the faces. Excellent. So as Anna said, we've been working a lot together, not only co-advising in Valencia, but also Anna has been co-advising and helping with the students here in Brazil. And I think this is a way of building bridges, right, between languages, between countries. We would be more than happy to, work with you in any capacity as co-advisors or simply as co-producers of these many stories that we can tell together.